architecture, and Philip was certainly a pioneer of that in this country for many, many years. He's made an officer of the Order of Australia for services to architecture, and he's a fellow of the Royal College of Humanities, which sounds really impressive. I don't really know what that one means, but he might tell us a bit about that. That sounds impressive. However, central to Philip's approach towards design, and as Simon said, being lucky enough to have worked with Philip now over the last few years, is the idea of drawing and communication. He'll tell you a little bit more about that. One of my favourite quotes about drawing is by Alvar Aalto, and he says, and I'll just get this right, he says, "I begin to draw rather like abstract art. Led by instincts, I draw not architectural syntheses, but more childish compositions, and via this route, I arrive at the basis of concepts." And that quote for me kind of spells out the way we work in our office, where sitting at and around Philip's table, there's always coloured pencils at the ready and always paper, and we sit around with our teams and we draw, and it's always interesting because you don't actually get the chance to express an idea unless you grab a coloured pencil. So some of my favourite things are when we have discussions about various design ideas, and what occurs are these wonderful drawings, and they can be very, very multicoloured, but they're the beginnings, if you like Aalto's drawings of the concepts that become the root into the design. So, ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce to you Philip Cox.
You say a few words. I'm just going to have a conversation with you.
Oh, I see. No, no. I thought I was going to just looking around the walls, I just wonder how long it'll be before a lot of this disappears, because the architect's office is taken over by computers, and very rarely do you see people sketching and putting ideas down on paper. They're working at a machine. Now, I've always been appalled at this. They said, "Oh, you're a Luddite, you're way behind the times." You know, that the computer is really the new pen, the new quill of contemporary society. But I wonder, when I go around and look at the screens, I don't see wonderful invention happening on the screen, perhaps because they're in transition. I have to confess that computer drawings can be very, very beautiful drawings, but they are impersonal drawings. You cannot distinguish between the authorship of a person who's worked on the computer with another. They come out very much the same. Now, those who were trained in the Beaux-Arts tradition, I think many of the architects here were trained to draw. And drawing was an essential component of an architect's training. And one of the great glories we had with Sydney University with Lloyd Rees and Ronald Maitland in our time, where they inspired us with their draftsmanship and skill, as well as being artists. And I hope most of you went to see the Lloyd Rees exhibition at the down at the Museum of Sydney, because the draftsmanship in those drawings is just unbelievably beautiful. And I asked Lloyd why he draw in the 20s so much, and he said, well, people couldn't afford paintings, but they could afford drawings. And he did these wonderful drawings of Sydney, which are not only beautiful in their own right, but give us an incredible record of what Sydney was in the 1920s, and most particularly what beautiful Moreton Bay figs there were around the harbour. These wonderful cathedrals of trees with their great trunks and their buttresses and their flying vaults and things with their branches. As Lloyd saw, the architecture of nature. Art is not taught at the universities in architecture anymore. It has disappeared from the curriculum entirely, and I think that's an enormous pity. And I can understand it in the age of computers and technology. But when you look around these walls here, that there are different sorts of drawings. There is Glenn Murcutt's working drawing. Now, a working drawing is a different thing to an inspired drawing. A working drawing is a technical drawing. It doesn't matter how beautifully it's composed and how lovely the lettering and the instruction on the drawing, it's nevertheless an impersonal drawing. It doesn't, the structure of the building itself can inspire, and it can be quite a revelation in terms of the sectional form of the building and how it's formed. But there's the other, which is the quicker sketch, which is the inspired sketch, the first thoughts that are put down on paper, and those are the things that interest me. I'm intrigued by, you know, the thought process that goes on with somebody who does a scribble, and the scribble becomes the cathedral, or the first idea becomes, you can see a whole you know, collection of ideas that are emerging from that to become a building, to be translated into a drawing, like the Merkert drawing that's on the end of the wall. And the other group of drawings is architects who aspire to be artists and who record their travels. And David Home is a past master of that. He's completed several books on travels, and it's interesting to see how an architect looks at the environment and what is interesting to them, what is the compositional value. You can look at, I was looking at some of David's drawings on Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. I look at those, I can look at Hagia Sophia or the Blue Mosque in a certain way, but it's so interesting looking at it through another person's eyes, of what they see in it. And I think that that's the lovely inspirational thing that comes. It's beyond photography. You know, if we had the Max Dupains looking at Hagia Sophia, they would see it in a most beautiful way too, but the photograph will never quite reveal the inner thinking or appreciation of the building that the architect artists might do. To me, they are equally interesting, you know, drawings. So I think if you look at the great history of architectural drawings, from Vitruvius, Canaletto's, and the great Renaissance artists where perspective was first invented. You know, before perspective, it was a planar form, and perspective was invented in the Renaissance. Suddenly the whole revelation of the three-dimensional aspects of what drawing and architecture became. And even now that the three-dimensional aspects of how you represent space is perhaps the most intriguing form. You may know that there's an incredible program called Rhino with computers that explore space, the three-dimensional aspect. But even when I look at those drawings, you know, shunted out by a computer, they still don't have the revelation of an architect drawing what he or she interprets as space. It's to be compared to the sculptor that does the sketches, you know, what sculpture, but sculpture being very much an external form, doesn't really explore the internal nature of space, which is like here, which is the inner side of sculpture. You can draw what discovery might look from the outside, but really the architecture is the internal exploration of what's internal in it. So that may prompt a few questions.
Yeah, of course. So Philip, your love of drawing, did it start very early on when you were young, or did it get more developed as you started doing architecture?
Well, I think yes, everybody does, you know, drawings when they're kids, and I think it's amazing when children do drawings of architecture. It's the pitch roof, it's the front door, and the windows are way up above the door because they can't see out of windows. And it's amazing that they're all the same. They always put the windows above the door. And I love these primitive drawings that you see in kindergartens, and the most joyous drawings of where they live and my bedroom and all this sort of thing. So I think we've all gone through that experience of drawing when we were children and when we were at school, developing the sense of drawing. And the skills of drawing, I think, should be developed as a very positive means of communication that we have. And it's often easier for people to communicate with a sketch than it is with words. I find that intriguing when people who say, "Oh, I can't draw beautifully," when they're describing something.
Yeah. But I think John Olsen once said that he aspired to be able to draw like a child, you know, because as you grow up, you tend to lose that sort of, you know, ability. So, Philip, I mean, obviously everyone knows you as a great architect. What makes you decide to become an architect in the first place?
It seemed to me that architecture was the one thing that had an intellectual basis to it. Not saying that art didn't, or other forms of art didn't have an intellectual base. But I suppose in the restricted academic side of the school that I went to, only the dumb kids did art, and if you in the top class you did, you know, French, Latin, Greek, chemistry, physics, maths 1 and maths 2, and that was it. And art was not even on the horizon. But the school I went to did have an art class that they had on a Friday afternoon, and you had to pay extra for that. So reluctantly, my parents paid a few dollars more to have the art class, and it was amazing that, you know, how many artists were there. Gary Shedd and Tim Storer and people like that were all a part of that community. And I always thought it was a bit like the Psycho Club, because they were all the weirdos at school, including myself, who went there to, you know, reveal their other side that was rugby, cricket and rowing. And, you know, you were considered a bit odd going to the art class. But that's where so many people were revealed and having great skills. And certainly through art, then I understood architecture more, because we talked about architecture. And it seemed to me that since I was in that group of people and had done all those terrible subjects, that I would continue on at university, you know, doing something that bore some resemblance to the former education I had, as well as my parents were horrified. And if I hadn't said I was an artist or something like that, they would have shot themselves up.
I remember when I was doing architecture in uni, you know, I think it was second or third year, you actually came to give a talk. And I was quite interested in one of the things you said. You said you got first class honours when you finished, but you didn't know anything about architecture until after you left. And I was sort of find it quite amusing, but then I think I realised what you're saying after I graduated. So, to a young architect, what would you like to say to them in terms of architecture?
Well, I think that the same thing as exists today. I mean, university courses are introductions to a life. They're not the end of a study, and universities have changed very much, you know, since the more classical times of going to Oxford or Cambridge and studying arts and then going on to study other things. And I've always been a great believer that there should be more generalised courses to round people, because the HSC, you know, leaves you at the edge of a cliff, really, and you really don't know what you want to do. But the interesting thing about university courses, and the Sydney University course was definitely a Beaux-Arts course. It was the last of the Beaux-Arts courses, and you know, people like Tony Corcoran, who was in my year here, despised it because they didn't talk. There's nothing spoken about contemporary architecture. I mean, their great belief was that architecture ended at the age of Lutyens, the Great Edwardian period, And Delhi was the pinnacle of architecture, and that was it. And Corbusier or Mies van der Rohe, I don't think their names were ever mentioned, you know, except in horror, you know, contemporary architecture and the purple thing, you know, just going pop. But the training which we had as a Beaux-Arts school taught us to draw, and it taught us to do those wonderful classical compositions. You know, we did the Parthenon, and that took 200 washes. We'd grind the Chinese sticking down, we'd filter it, and we'd put on 5 washes, and we'd take off 5 washes, and you develop a drawing that had this incredible luster, the depth of tone in it, and the gradation of shade and shadow, and the way in which light fell on the Parthenon. You actually, you know, being associated with the Parthenon for weeks and weeks and weeks on end made you really love that building in the end. And the subtlety, you know, the emphasis of bending the columns, and all of that became a great revelation. And I think that training in a very disciplined way, as opposed to freehand drawing, was a very important part. And in the Beaux-Arts training, they believed in esquisses, and it was the French word of spontaneous drawing, quick drawings. And we used to have one-day problems, which were fantastic. They'd give you a problem, and you'd have to do it in one day, you know. Design a church or design you know, something or other, and you'd have to quickly do it and translate it. And that's where drawing came into its own, that you quickly, you know, assembled ideas in your head and you translated them in a very, very positive way onto it. But now they've abandoned things like that at universities, and it's a great pity that you don't develop in people's minds quick responses and exploring ideas through drawing themselves.
Mm-hmm. So Philip, I mean, obviously you in practice for a very long time. I remember when you first started with Ian Mackay and yourself. So how does it evolve? Like, obviously you've done very well, you know, and Cox Architecture is really one of the top firms with a lot of directors, a lot of variety of work and so on. So where do you get from, like, when you first graduated to where you are now?
Well, when I first graduated, as you said, prefaced the thing, I knew nothing. I literally didn't. I had a good knowledge, I think, of building construction. I think that we got that. We knew how to lay bricks and how to put timber together. We knew nothing about steel, and we knew nothing about concrete. But we did have an appreciation of the very elementary things, and I think mainly because you know, it was English architecture inspired each by Oriental architecture. I think we studied Chinese and Japanese architecture a lot. We were enchanted by that. Of course, the universities ignored, you know, anything Southeast Asian or Asian architecture. It was just didn't appear. It was Europe and America and Australia. So anything up there, too difficult, you know. But we were inspired by that, and I think that Tokal, you can see the influences of Japanese architecture and Chinese, particularly in the development of space, and the articulation of timber, and how timber was used with the rafters, and the expression of all the roof structures and the float forms, which are very much characteristic of both Chinese and Japanese architecture, where roofs float across the landscape and are not anchored. That is very characteristic of Tokal. So that led to, you know, other things, and he went one way and I went the other, and I became more structural, I suppose, and was given a, you know, with the NCDC, which is building a stadium for the first time, and in Canberra they gave me the job doing that. So that launched us off in a different field.
Yeah, so now you're basically known for doing a lot of sports arena and so on. And like at the moment, like maybe you might let the audience know what sort of projects are you working on.
Well, the project which we're working on is the National Maritime Museum in Tianjin, and that's a huge building in genuine Chinese style. It's a huge statement for the nation, but there's no collection. I mean, it's always where is your collection? What are you going to show it? Oh, you don't worry about that. I said, but you're not really a maritime nation. I don't see the fleets of ships. Or I said, don't worry, we will sort that out. We may invent some. But I'm going to be intrigued what they put it in there. But it's an enormous space. But I think a lot of the display that will be by video screening and things like that, and showing very much the past of Admiral Hu and people like that, who in what was it, the 15th century China were quite adventurous in their navigation, and did actually arrive in Australia and they took one look and left, like a lot of other people. But so Maritime Museum is an interesting one, and then you know, in enormous contrast to that, I'm doing a tiny little art shed for myself at Bamagui. So yin yang.
This will be probably a difficult question. You've done so many buildings. Do you have any that you would say that they are your favorites?
Well, they're all your favourite, but my favourite one was pulled out.
Yes.
That was the exhibition centre in Darling Harbour, which was a positive crime. And to think of the ugliness that has replaced it is unbelievable. I mean, I thought that you know, if they had replaced it by a beautiful building, that's fair enough. But to tear something down and replace it by, you know, very, very poor and ugly buildings is a crime.
Yeah. So, besides architecture, you also have a great love of art. I think in the early days, you actually friends with a lot of Australian artists. You collected extensively of their work, like Michael Johnson and so on. Tell us a little bit about, you know, how that sort of started, and you know.
Well, it all started in Lavender Bay. I was sharing a flat with Gary Shedd, and around the corner was John Phil Smith, and there was Brett Whiteley further up, and Michael Johnson was hanging around in Glebe and places like that. But it was definitely a very positive art movement in the 70s, early 70s and 80s, and I would say that it was beyond the establishment of, you had Williams and you had Olsen and Nolan and people like that, who were formed a very established, what can I say, almost a realistic form of representation, as opposed to the Sydney abstractionists, which were first Smith and definitely Michael Johnson, John Peart and others like that. And that they formed their own, you know, this exciting group of painters, which I had as friends, and I always liked conversing with them what art and architecture was all about, and seeing the world as they saw it too, and with nature, and particularly Michael Johnson, who was total abstractionist, who I always thought was a landscape painter. Nobody else could see that he was a landscape painter. I still maintain he is.
Seascape.
But it's funny how it's moved back to realism, I think. You know, abstraction is almost a thing that's over in the Sydney art world, and we've gone back to installation art and realism, which is not all that interesting. I don't think it's as exciting as the work that was coming out of the, the 70s, 80s, 90s period.
You also have a strong interest in Asian art. You're director on the board of East Asia. So how does that sort of like got started as well?
Well, like everybody else with the art gallery, you get hooked in, to try and raise money for them, and that seems to be the main object of being on any committee at the art gallery. No, it's not an intellectual pursuit. But having been appointed, I've been trying to advocate for the contemporary Asian art. And it's amazing that the Art Gallery in New South Wales has really never had exhibitions of contemporary Asian art. We've never had Indonesian contemporary, we've never had Malaysian, Singaporean, Japanese. There has been a minor one on Chinese, but rather a cliched one, I think, rather than looking at it in a more comprehensive way. And India, of course. But our near neighbours get ignored. And I'm always frustrated that we don't have enough exhibitions. Being on that committee, I've said we must have 2 major exhibitions a year and about 3 or 4 minor ones to make sure that the Australian public is made aware of what is happening to the north of us. And I travel quite extensively and I go to art exhibitions overseas. I'm absolutely stunned by the quality of the work that's being done, especially in Indonesia. I mean, of all places, that it is fantastic work being done up there. We're not seeing it, we're not exchanging. And the other thing which we should be doing is exporting our own art to those countries and making sure that China gets a very good exhibition of Australian art. The French do it, the English do it, every other country in the world is always bombarding Shanghai and Beijing with wonderful exhibitions of their work, but somehow Australia, it lags behind that, and that's a great pity. And I think it's a lack of energy that we've got here that prevents that happening. So you and I have got to still push them, to make sure that something happens in the future.
Yeah. You also collect a bit of Aboriginal art. Do you see a market overseas for Aboriginal art at all?
Well, it's amazing when they had the Australian exhibition at the Academy in London. It was the Australian Aboriginal stuff that drew attention. It wasn't the European inspired work of art. And the reviews that I read from the London newspapers were raving about the Aboriginal work and the degree of abstraction without the metaphysical overtone of it. I think people are beginning to realise the value of our Indigenous art. There's a lot of crappy Indigenous art, I'm afraid, which brings, and people don't know the difference between, I think, the tourist stuff and what is a genuine painting. And it's we've got to segregate the good and the bad, but the good is superb. I mean, I think some of the paintings we recently acquired at the Art Gallery in New South Wales are really some of the great paintings. And women like Molly Gowing, for instance, started collecting Aboriginal art and gave her collection to the gallery, which is an outstanding collection as well. But you need the Hetty Perkins and people like that to keep on pushing and promoting Aboriginal art in the right place.
On the subject of Art Gallery of New South Wales, everyone's have an opinion about Sydney Modern. So what do you think?
I think it's misguided. I don't know whether you read an article by Andrew Anderson in last weekend's paper. He said that there hadn't been enough exploration of the alternatives to the extension of Art Gallery of New South Wales, the taking up of the Botanic Gardens to the northeast was wrong in his opinion, and it should have been to the northwest over the railway tracks where the Eastern Suburbs Railway comes in, or taking up Barangaroo, that cavernous space underneath Keating's Folly, would have been a wonderful place to put an art gallery. It's still available.
Could be still, surely.
They should, instead of trying to raise 400 million, they've got a space there and they could really do something with it. And I was down there this morning taking a walk, and it really is, quite an opportunity of creating a satellite art gallery for Art Gallery in New South Wales, because you're taking away that romantic Victorian idea of a temple in the park, and that was how it was conceived. This lovely neoclassical building sitting in the park with the library, with all our other institutions. As soon as you expand it and you multiply it many times, even though it's glass, which is terribly dubious really in terms of the degree of gallery you're getting is all underground. And the only structures that you're getting above ground are foyers, conference rooms, entertainment spaces. Now, okay, this may make money for the gallery, but at what cost to our environment, where we're eroding, our green space, when the alternatives haven't been explored? And the other one that Anderson mentioned was, shouldn't we be looking at Greater Sydney? Shouldn't we be making more opportunities, say at Parramatta or Liverpool, particularly Parramatta being the epicentre of Sydney from a geographic viewpoint? Should we be putting a gallery there? I mean, the Tate's done it. Tate didn't put everything in the one page. All the big galleries in America have always had satellites. I think that they really need to rethink it, because raising 400 million, or it's now nearly 500 million, is a big ask. For philanthropy, it's impossible. For government, it becomes a very difficult situation.
On the subject of Parramatta, what do you think of relocating the Powerhouse Museum to Parramatta?
In one sense it's okay, but raping the site with government for the so you can develop for residential is absurd.
It's not happening.
Really?
Mm-hmm. I'll tell you why later.
You talked to Mike there, have you?
Jenny's got insight.
Yeah, right.
But I think it's a great pity. Sydney does need. Sydney depends on tourism a lot, and the more you have entertainment for tourists, with powerhouses and museums around within the Darling Harbour area, I think that is the tourist centre of Sydney, where you only have to go down there any weekend. It's throbbing with people. It's got all the right ingredients down there, and it's a lovely counterfoil for the Opera House and Circular Quay, and having a different sort of entertainment. And the powerhouse, I believe, is it's essential that you have some entertainment there for tourism, and an educational complex, which is for the Sydney schools.
On that subject, Philip, what's your vision for Sydney? Because at the moment there's a lot of infrastructure being built, there's a lot of development like Barangaroo, Darling Harbour and so on. How do you see, if it is your vision, how would you like to see Sydney as a city?
Well, there's two Sydneys, isn't there? There's CBD Sydney, and then there's Greater Sydney. Taking Sydney CBD, the things that have happened at Barangaroo are not in the best interest. I think there's a massive overdevelopment for it, and when you go down there, instead of being delighted by the streetscapes and the relationship to the water, it's a very disappointing area to be in. the streets are dark and gloomy. It's okay in, you know, midsummer, but winter, you know, they'll be drafty and unusable. You know, it's really the aberration of British architects, or, you know, that's how Richard Rogers has done the buildings down there. We're having Renzo Piano, and we're having, forget the others, doing all the buildings. There's not an Australian architect, except on a tiny bit on the waterfront, which I think Alex Harms and Andrew Anderson did, which aren't good buildings anyway. I mean, I think it's some of their worst buildings that have got the sheer walls. They have no affinity with the water. It's just a bad thing. However, Sydney remains charming because of its location. It always will be. Melbourne, I see a lot. I find I've got a greater affinity to these days. I find it a much more livable city. It is #1 livable city in the world, as you know, the ranking. Sydney isn't. You know, I can understand why. But Sydney, suffers from rapacious development. When it's had the opportunities of freeing it up and creating more public amenity and space, it hasn't taken that opportunity. It is constrained. It is totally constipated now. It's got nowhere to go. After you do Barangaroo, you can go to Central Railway, and Central Railway will be developed. And then you've got the Baysbury thing, which is the White Bay and the around the industrial areas of Rozelle. They are coming up for redevelopment, and it'll be very interesting to see whether we again commit all the same crimes and allowing development that is not appropriate for the harbour to be allowed there. But when you take Greater Sydney, I think Greater Sydney is becoming of age. Parramatta is becoming a much more livable place. It's becoming more of a, the city block and all the rest of it. Suburban living, greater amenity to cultural events.
At this point in time, we still got a bit of time, so I might just open up the floor for anyone who may like to ask Philip any questions.
Jenny's going to tell us why powerhouses.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
That's what do they call them? Chatham House rules apply today. But I do have a question or two. First of all, a statement and a commercial from me. It seems I might have a publisher for a reissue of the book I wrote about you, Philip Cox, Portrait of an Australian Architect, and still available at vast expense, though the publishers Penguin Viking have been gobbled up by America. And I am very glad to be here today because I've garnered a lot of footnotes for the reissue of that book, which was originally for students and with a lot more illustrations. And I'm very happy to say that it's underway. I've been working on it recently.
That's a good.
And the other question is a rather more personal question. Did you ever regret not doing architecture at the University of New South Wales, where my dad, Foundation Dean of Architecture, Town Planning and Building, and a good bricklayer, actually knew Mies van der Rohe? Or were you happy with some of the antediluvians you in the other place?
I was inspired by the sandstone and sandstone alone, not what they were teaching.
Anyone else? Question? Julie.
I was just wondering if you kept your earlier working drawings, if you kept those lovely watercolours as well.
And the colour washes, the black and white washes, have you any of those? I'll buy one.
Very few. The library's got a few, quite a few. Yeah. But they was storage, in those days. We had, we used to do all our drawings on fashion board. And fashion board was cartridge paper stuck onto a board, and you'd end up with tons of this material, and you didn't know what to do with it. So a lot did go to the tip, particularly all the student work.
Yes. Anyone else? Yes, Mark.
Just wondering, these days with councils always insisting on photo montages and clients insisting on photorealistic renderings, do you think there's still a place, or should be a place, for more evocative presentation sketches of the finished design?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, why not? And it's how you interpret those conditions and what gives the real meaning to having to do the montages. You're trying to get a message across that, yes, it fits in, or how it relates, and all the rest of it. Well, the sketch will give you and the way that you present that will give you a much more instant communication with whoever you have to communicate with. But there's lots of ways of doing that. I mean, this drawing here is a way of communicating in an abstracted form, but you have to have the receiver of that being able to interpret it. And many times we might look at a way in this abstraction as opposed to a more literal interpretation, to blocking and seeing the masses and forms. I think it's the imagination that's the important thing, and the interpretation from that.
Anyone else? Another question? Okay, I'd like to thank Philip for a very interesting and inspiring talk. You can continue to have a private chat to Philip and look at the exhibition and have a few drinks at the same time. Thank you.